Welcome to unit number 1 of our new series, Finding God Through Faith and Reason. I'm Father Robert Spitzer. I'm the president of Gonzaga University, but I also happen to teach Faith and Reason over at Gonzaga and have taught this course and courses on proofs for the existence of God and metaphysics at 4 different universities over the last 20 years. Just wanted to introduce you to an overview of what is really possible in our Catholic tradition, a tradition which has so very much respected this connection between faith and reason, as the Holy Father has suggested, and as even Pope John Paul II suggested many times, because faith and reason come from the very same source, which of course is God. What we'd like to do in this series right now is to give you an overview of some of the possibilities. And then there's a book on this, which I'll talk about a little later. There's also the Faith and Reason Institute at Gonzaga University that might be able to help you out as well. There's some complex material here, and what I want to just do with you right now is to give you a sense of what the possibilities are in this series, and to give you a little bit of a flavor for the kinds of proof that there are, and then you can go into a little bit more depth later on. What I'd like to suggest right now, though, is that we just take a look at who the audience for this might be. Obviously, some of you who are watching the television right now are very convinced of your faith, and certainly you have good reason for that, both from your own interior knowledge of God and from the exterior knowledge of God that the Church has given us. But you might know someone who is struggling a little bit with their faith, someone who is having real difficulty with their faith right now. And maybe it's a nephew, or maybe it's a niece, or a child, or a grandchild, or something of that nature. And maybe you'd like in some way to help them. So you might want to recommend this series, which will be airing at this particular time. And of course, as you do, you might suggest that they even watch the entire series, which will be made available upon the series completion. It'll be made available on videotape. If you have any difficulties beyond that, you may want to consult the Gonzaga Institute on Faith and Reason, and or consult the book which is coming out on this, called New Proofs for the Existence of God, and that is written by me. But let's get to the content for just a moment and sort of delve into some of the matters that we are going to discuss. The first relevant distinction that we need to make is the distinction between what's called publicly accessible evidence and privately accessible evidence. And this is just fancy terms for the following. Something which is publicly accessible, that means that you and I, we can experience it at the same time. So you might say, well, the clock is in Spitzer's hand. And of course, if you look at that clock and you we experience it together, you could say, well, yeah, that's right. And if there are several of you in the viewing audience and you're all experiencing it together, you'd say, yeah, that's publicly corroboratable. We're all pretty much seeing the same thing. And so we can pretty much be sure that, yeah, that clock really is in Father Spitzer's hand. And then again, we have other kinds of publicly accessible evidence, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But just remember this one thing, that what we're trying to do with proofs is give publicly accessible evidence, publicly corroboratable evidence. We're trying to give evidence that you and I can verify together. And when we verify it together, we can say, yeah, we're quite sure that this is true because we have access to it, and we believe that that is true to the best of our knowledge and ability. You also have another kind of evidence, and that's called privately accessible evidence, and you can't discount privately accessible evidence because it is so important in the spiritual life. However, privately accessible evidence, well, that's not the same public corroboratable evidence, right? That's a little bit different. It's things which happen to us. So it could be some a kind of a spiritual experience that we might have, like some of the saints have had. And sometimes you know that experience is when God comes up to us and gives us a real sense of joy or love, or just a sense of unity with Himself and everything that is in the world. And all of a sudden you just get that incisive God's signature written in your heart, and you kind of recognize that as God. Or perhaps you have an experience where you feel like God was drawing you in His divine providence, was drawing you to something, a way of life, or to a conversion. And certainly in my own life, I've had those times when I feel like, boy, there were no accidents here. I went from A to B to C to D when I would have rather gone from A to Z to X to Y. And suddenly I find myself almost drawn, despite myself, despite my best intentions, despite any prudential action, I find myself almost drawn to, of course, this idea of God leading me. But then again, you can't experience that the same way I do. You couldn't experience my conversion, or my spiritual experience, or my being led by God, and not believing for a second that God wasn't leading me, because it was just too much beyond me, and finding myself at the place where I am, and you're utterly convinced the Holy Spirit was right there. Why, that is God. Well, that would be, of course, privately accessible evidence. That would be the kind of evidence that we can't experience together. Now, when we deal with proofs, we're going to be dealing with publicly accessible, publicly corroboratable evidence, the kind of evidence that we can all experience together, because if it's publicly corroboratable, we call that proof, because, of course, we can acknowledge commonly. We can, if the evidence is good, we can say, okay, I can acknowledge that, I can see that, that's corroboratable, and you have equal access to that data as well as I do. So for all intents and purposes then, privately accessible evidence is great. It's deep. It's God speaking to me as an individual human being and leading me, or giving me an experience of Himself, or giving me a sense of being guided. And you don't doubt for a moment that it's God. And I don't want to diminish that privately accessible evidence, because it is such a wellspring for our faith. It grounds our faith so very, very deeply. But we can't experience it together because we don't have equal access. Whereas with the publicly accessible kind of access, you do have equal access. Now, being that that's the case, let's just go one step further. Well, what do you mean by publicly accessible evidence? What's out there for us to verify together? Well, there's two kinds predominantly, and of course you can have mixtures of these two kinds, but right now there's two basic kinds of publicly accessible evidence. And they're called a priori evidence and a posteriori evidence. Now, those are pretty fancy Greek terms and other Latin terms that have this sense to them that you think, well, what does that mean? Easy way to remember. A priori, just think to yourself, that would be prior to sensation, prior to experience. I don't have to make recourse to my sensation or my experience. Whereas a posteriori, the easy way to remember that is, well, that's after my experience. It's somehow after, sensation. So I do have to make recourse to my experience or to my sensation. So this kind of a fact, we'll call this a posteriori